Hey deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from actually I haven't done this video in a while, so there's been 3 weeks of comments that I have to catch up on. Bachelorette, I decided, because a lot of people emailed me, said you have to watch the Greg Katie situation on Bachelorette and comment on it, so I did. So Florence says, oh my God, this is happening. Thanks, Dr. Kirk Honda, for always hearing the listeners. You reacting to Bachelorette has made my day. Yeah. So, by the way, if you ever want me to watch anything, just comment or DM or whatever, email, go to the website, psychologyinseattle.com, and emails. Pinko says, Greg is shocked to find out that apparently he's been on The Bachelorette this whole time. Right. It did seem like he didn't really understand he was on a show. Lisa says, it's pretty interesting to hear you speak about a vulnerability hangover. I've never heard it put that way before, but that's exactly how it feels. Yes, in my world of both as therapists and friends of therapists, but also with students who are training to become therapists, maybe just in my circle as well, there's this common experience where people will be extremely vulnerable with each other, and then later on you have kind of a backlash emotionally to it, where you feel like you might have been too vulnerable, or you just aren't used to being that vulnerable and unsafe and unsure, and there could be a vulnerability hangover. Tiffany says, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do. I know this is what Dr. Honda says at the outro every time, but for some reason today, when I heard it, it made me cry. Yeah, Tiffany, absolutely. I say this at the end of every video. I've said it for, I don't know, 11 years on the podcast. I mean it when I say things like that. It is, from the heart. I'm not just saying things. I mean, maybe 1 out of every 50 times I say it, I'm just kind of saying it because it's something that I say. But the rest of the time, I say it because I mean it. And really everything that I do on the podcast is along that way. I hope that I can always be genuine with myself and what I'm saying. I don't ever want it to be just something that I'm saying as a matter of routine. Jordine says, I think the confusion with calling this gaslighting came more from Greg being convinced he knew what Katie was thinking and feeling and telling her what she truly felt to her face. Right. So in the video, we heard accusations of gaslighting and a lot of commenters saying, is Greg gaslighting her? And I explained that in the clinical literature for the past number of decades, me and people in my field, have been using the term gaslighting pretty much exclusively in abusive relationships that are ongoing, and the perpetrator is on a purposeful and intentional campaign to undermine the victim's ability to judge reality and to judge their own memory. Because for a high control abusive individual to stay in control, it's helpful for them, for their own goals, to undermine the victim's ability to trust their own judgment. And so a perpetrator might say something like, I didn't say that. I don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. You always do stuff like this. Like you frequently don't remember things right, or you're just being emotional. There's something weird about you. It's a way of trying to gain control. And when the perpetrator is, at least on the psychopathic antisocial spectrum, they do this maliciously. They do it purposefully. It's an evil act. It's an immoral, evil act. It usually comes from attachment insecurity. It doesn't make it okay. And when people in the society started on the internet the past 4 or 5 years started using the word gaslighting in these very different contexts, I kept wondering, why are they using the word gaslighting? It seems like they're just saying lying. So, and as I said in the video, is Greg gaslighting Katie? Well, we have to define gaslighting in terms of what that means, but in my definition, it didn't look like gaslighting to me. It didn't look like high control. It didn't look like he was a perpetrator of intimate partner violence. It didn't look like he was lying, because when you're gaslighting, you're lying to the person. You're lying. You're trying to undermine the person's ability to judge reality. You've thought about it. You've premeditated it. It's over time. You're playing the long game. You're essentially a con artist to your partner. Do I believe that Greg was doing that? No. Particularly because he walked away from the relationship. Gaslighters use these tactics as a way of gaining control and closeness with their victim. So Greg walked away from the relationship. And now, could Greg be lying? Sure, he could be lying. We'll never know. Okay, everyone could be lying. I could be lying right now. There's just no way to know if anyone is lying. Do I think Greg was lying? No, he seemed genuinely in love, and then he got triggered, and he fell into a black abyss, and it was, impossible, apparently, for him to crawl his way out of that. And he felt as though Katie was pulling away from him, and felt as though Katie was purposely pulling away from him. That's the way it felt to him, and that's the way he kept saying it. He kept saying, no, you pulled away from me. This is your fault. This is your fault. Now, if he didn't believe that, but he was just saying it to undermine her ability to think straight, then that is gaslighting. But I don't think so. I think Greg was triggered. And as I said in the video, we all understand that people have defense mechanisms, right? We all understand that sometimes people are distorted. And so attributing the concept of gaslighting whenever anyone is confused in a relationship is a little wrong-headed, in my opinion. But what Jordan is saying is that the way they're using the term gaslighting is that Greg being convinced he knew what Katie was thinking and feeling. Okay, if that's how people are in the layperson world using the term gaslighting, then I don't know what I think about that. On one hand, I'm like, well, language changes. On the other hand, I think we should have more precision in our language because it undermines true gaslighting victims when we just start using the word in this completely haphazard way. I mean, just imagine if you're a victim of abuse and people just started using the word abuse, which people do sometimes in this very haphazard way, like calling Greg abusive to Katie, for example, that he's a domestic violence perpetrator or something. And you're just like, no, he's a confused emotional wreck, but he's not an abusive person in general. Now, maybe he is, but not in the scenes that we saw. And so these kinds of words that get thrown around on the internet as a way of, I don't know what, trying to make a point. I don't know why people have a hard time with nuanced gray language. And gaslighting is a very extreme kind of black and white term. But anyway, so if people are using this term, they're saying that Greg was convinced he knew what Katie was thinking and feeling. Yeah, I think Greg did seem convinced of what Katie was thinking and feeling. And he was making his argument, but I don't think he was doing it on purpose. I think he genuinely thought Katie was lying to him, which happens. If you've ever been in a conflict with your spouse or a friend or anything, you will frequently, in the midst of the fight, think the other person is lying to you. The other person's deceiving themselves or you, or and it's almost never the case. It's distortion. People are emotional creatures. They get distorted. And Greg, I think, was massively distorted. I think Katie loved him and was nice to him and was on a reality TV show, and Greg misinterpreted it and had some kind of relational trauma that was triggered that very much pushed him into a black and white state of mind and scared the bejesus out of him, and he didn't know what to do and he panicked. If that's gaslighting, then I guess every relationship problem is gaslighting. Rita says, gaslighting in mainstream is a colloquial term. Essentially, the gaslighter is telling you how you feel, which may not be reflective of how you actually feel. Yeah, okay, if that's how people are, I don't recommend people use that. I recommend that people use a different term, like, you're telling me how I feel. Just say that term. Just say, you're telling me how I feel, but you're wrong about how I feel. How about you just say that? You seem very convinced of how I feel, but you are wrong. This is how I feel. And you're very convinced of how I feel. It's not how I feel. You're wrong. You're not in my body. You don't know how I feel. You're just going to have to trust me. I feel this other way. Katie says, you're saying I don't love you. You're saying I'm pulling away. That's not how I feel. I feel very much like I was being a good partner to you. And I was very much in your corner. I had a lot of empathy for you as you were crying. I'm on a show, so I can't just, forge ahead as if I'm not on a show, but I have feelings for you. And Greg, you're telling me that I don't, but I do. Can't we just say that? Why do we have to say gaslighting? I don't know. Maybe I'm just a jerk face. Ruby says, I think people use the term gaslighting as a term for lying. Yeah. Yeah. And again, even that accusation is weird. It's like, do you think Greg is lying? I don't. Does anyone think Greg is lying? I mean, maybe, like I said, maybe he is, but I think he was just triggered. Do we, another thing that I'll say is that there seems to be a gender aspect of this, of that when men are confused and triggered and reactive and wrong-headed, it's like, oh, they're gaslighting me. Instead of saying, you know that men have triggers, right? You know that men get confused, right? You know that men can have wrong-headedness. You know that men can have emotional, relational traumas that can cause them to become paranoid, right? So this, I often, I'm just like, and this is something that I run into with my trainees, actually. Not all of them, but I'd say maybe half. I actually have to break them of this sexist notion, because most of my trainees are women. I have to break them of this notion that men don't have feelings, that men are robots, that men are monsters sometimes, but at the very least that men don't have emotions. And I feel like the internet kind of exhibits that sometimes, that and men are to blame for this, because they often will come across, they'll try to bolster this idea that they don't have emotions, so because they're socialized to idealize that. But I find that when men are triggered, obviously, and their traumas are coming up, there's this assumption that the men are evil and that they're doing it on purpose, when, again, we can all understand that they're human beings and, people have issues. And so with my trainees, I would have to spend some amount of time on that notion, because for some of my trainees, they literally had no good role models of men in their lives. It was a man who was safe, a man who was emotional in a vulnerable, healthy manner. And to sometimes that person would be their therapist, or me, if their therapist was a man as well. That I would have to, and sometimes would, not always obviously, but if I was close enough to my trainees, I would become this good example, this first example of a man who was safe and vulnerable. Angela, and I'm happy to do that. It's a corrective experience, and it's literally the meaning of my life to provide those kinds of experiences for people, because people provided experiences like those for me when I was coming up in the field. Angela and Michael. Katarine says, it seems Angela has been leading Michael on the idea, leading him on with the idea of a baby, kind of like Ed did with Rose. I don't think she ever intended on having a baby. Yeah, I mean, we'll never be inside Angela's head, but I think it's possible that she at least partially knew that she wasn't really enthusiastic about having a baby, and she was saying that because she knew Michael wanted to do that. But I could also imagine a world in which Angela thought, well, maybe, I don't know how old she was at the time, 52 or something, and she could have thought, well, maybe something will work out. Anyway. Hanny says, I think Angela was going to flash. Okay, because in the flash, when she flashed, I was like, what is happening? Why is she doing this? Hanny says, I think Angela was going to flash the TV cameras like that, however the conversation went. All right. It's possible. Marlene says, I think Angela is using the shock and awe tactic to silence her enemies. Yeah, it could be. Mostly Stylish says, FYI, saying I'm sorry. So because Michael keeps saying I'm sorry to Angela. Saying I'm sorry in his language doesn't translate perfectly. Often when Nigerians say it, it is to show empathy. It's one reason he says it a lot. Interesting. So Michael might be saying, I'm with you or something. And sometimes he actually says that. He was saying that when she was crying. And he's saying he's sorry as a way of trying to say that he's with her. Raquel says, a now former friend aggressively mooned me. So the flashing. A now former friend aggressively mooned me in the middle of an unhinged rant similar to this one. I think he was trying to get a reaction out of me since I had remained pretty calm up until that point. It gave me that feeling that if he's doing this, then what else is he capable of? Yeah. It escalated to him knocking over a bookshelf in my direction as I tried to leave. So it almost seems like it could be a precursor to or substitute for violent behavior. Big yikes. Yeah, Raquel, I'm sorry you went through that. It sounds awful, and I can absolutely relate to that. When people do things that are off kilter, it has either the intended effect or the unintended effect on the receiver of the communication of, whoa, if this person's capable of that, then what else are they capable of doing? And we could imagine that Angela, it was actually purposely trying to do that. Sirius says, this one was particularly hard for me. It felt like a show of dominance that Angela was doing. I think I saw it this way because I have childhood traumas from being flashed and cornered. It can be used to make the other person feel powerless. Yeah, absolutely. I think some other people were commenting that maybe she was interested in her plastic surgery and was wanting to show off and thought this was a good opportunity. I don't know. But yeah, it absolutely could be a behavior of dominance of, and we're used to seeing it in men, but obviously if a woman's doing it, it might, or with a woman's doing it, it might be harder to detect, but we can imagine that Angela could engage in that kind of toxic masculine mode of communicating and trying to dominate other people. And yeah, it's absolutely a thing of just like, look at me, I'm in your face, I'm bigger than you, and you can't, you know, I'm gonna get you. And it also makes you wonder if Angela has experienced that as a victim. I wouldn't be surprised if Angela has a number of, or at least important stories from her history where people did similar things to her under duress. Brandon and Julia, during the mansplaining episode when the friends were trying to get Julia to have a kid, Monique says, I don't like Brandon telling Julia to be normal whenever she gets upset. It's dismissive and insulting. It gives me that she's an hysterical woman vibe, and I don't appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely, it can have that communication. But it's hard to know what Brandon is saying when he's saying normal. I would want to know what he means by that. I suspect what he is trying to do is he's trying to say, hey, could you just be like relaxed? And because he's generally more relaxed. Now, he can be very hurtful in a calm way, but he's generally more subdued, and I think that's the way he likes things to be. And you just wonder about the dynamic between Brandon and his parents. And you also wonder about, as a child, Brandon might want his parents to be normal or his mom to be normal. It's a question. All right, Jovi and Yara at the strip club from a couple weeks ago. Keisha says, Jovi may have attachment issues because his dad worked like he did, gone weeks or months at a time. Yeah, a number of people commented on this, and it's a very astute comment and observation and conceptualization, and one that's near and dear to my heart. And I can't believe I hadn't talked about it before, is that and we don't know because we would have to investigate thoroughly, but it's possible, it's a possible line of investigation that because the father was gone all the time, periodically, that for Jovi, he experienced that as hurtful to him in terms of his attachment security, and thus acts out that attachment and security with his relationship by being cold and withdrawn. I mean, one of the things, who knows, but one of the coping styles that you can develop from a parent who disappears frequently is to turn yourself off and just try not to depend on other people. And, you know, that's something that way. And also to see that as a version of love, as a, you know, who knows, but it's possible that he saw because the mom, Jovi's mom, might have also been upset about him leaving all the time. And maybe he's still playing that out. We sometimes do that. We sometimes replay our parents' relationships as a way of trying to correct for the past, or as a way of just using a template of something we saw as normal for us. Anyway, Aurea emailed in, went to psychologyinseattle.com, clicked on the contact button. She says, ex-stripper here. The clubs are full of Jovies. And here's why they're seemingly addicted to coming to a strip club. They use the strip scene as their identity. They don't have the confidence to be the social butterfly and heart of the party, but their insecurity desperately needs to think of themselves that way because they have no other identity to latch on to. So in order to keep the belief to themselves that they are the party boy, the king of the social scene, They will cling to strip clubs because it's a place to show masculinity and hedonism without needing the confidence or resources to throw their own events or hold their own parties. End of email. Interesting. Yeah, I could absolutely see that. And I've seen that in clients at times, that for some people, they're struggling with their own identity. Their life isn't going quite the way they wanted it to, and they have all these mixed up goals and emotions in their psyche, and a strip club can kind of meet their needs in some way, because if they have the money and the time, I suppose, then it's a fake environment of attention where someone is paying attention to you, someone is maybe even touching you, maybe not sexually, but at least like in a dating kind of context-ish way. And it makes you feel special. It makes you feel like a life of the party. It makes you feel like you matter. It makes you feel like you have a social life. It makes you feel like you're on top of the world. And it can have, because if you buy into the fantasy of it, meaning that you buy into the fantasy that these individuals really want to talk to you, which is possible at times. I know that happens, but a lot of times, these people, the strip club employees, they're at work, and they're trying to earn their living, and they socialize outside of work. Anyway, so if you buy into the fantasy, then it can be a fantasy fast track to an identity and a matter of getting your needs met. And I'll add to this in that there's a lot of people walking around who are lonely, and not only emotionally but also physically lonely. And when you have that, when your needs aren't being met in that way, and you have a hard time getting those needs met, and you might not even know you have those needs, then a strip club can, or other kinds of sex work involvement, can be a very tempting avenue to get your needs met. I will say that it's not inherently unhealthy to do that. It's just maybe not optimal, because we would hope that people could have ongoing relationships with people who you're not paying. But there's nothing wrong with sex work inherently. Anyway, just what do I say about sex work? Sex work is complicated. Obviously, there are millions upon millions of sex workers around the world. And in some situations, it is extremely harmful to everyone involved, particularly the sex worker. Other times, it is not. And sometimes it's unhealthy, sometimes it's healthy, sometimes it's ethical, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's done in a way where everyone is, it's a win-win. Other times it's a win-lose. So it's a wide open field. There's a lot of different things to it. And we need to, if we're going to understand it and research it and deal with it, we have to destigmatize it to some extent and talk about it, because it's happening, and sometimes it can be used for good things. Let me give you an example of a good thing. So you have someone who is, in between relationships, shall we say, and they are, they just want someone to hold them and to listen to them. And obviously a therapist isn't likely to do that. And they just want that physical touch and, hands through the hair and just calming voice. We all want that, right? And if you can't find that in the world, and you desperately need it, because we all kind of need that almost daily, then finding someone ethical, someone who is not being exploited to provide that service for a fee is, potentially a win-win. Obviously, there are other manifestations of that work that is extremely problematic, sex trafficking, all that. Kalani and Asuelu. Hi, he says, I think Tammy and his mom have always treated him this way and are threatened by Kalani because she allows Asuelu to have a voice and she's helped him develop a backbone. Yeah, absolutely. 22, Kirsty says, as a former waitress, I used to hate customers arguing over who would pay. I don't have time to stand here while y'all decide. Wait, why is Kirsty talking about that? Because was that me? Was I talking about that? I think Kirsty's talking about me and my family. But yeah, what was I talking about? I'm going to assume that I was talking about the Japanese American cultural aspect of, if you're going to be a good Japanese American, you have to fight over the check. And absolutely. So not only do I have that as a Japanese American of like, I will absolutely, or all the adults. When I was a kid, it was all the aunts and uncles and the grandparents. They were, you know, they would fight about it for literally 45 minutes while we're at the restaurant. And when I was young, I just didn't really pay attention, but because it was just more time I could hang with my cousins. Actually, it was a thing that we knew about because we just, you know, I was really good friends with my cousins and we didn't get to see each other all that often. And the parents would say, okay, we're going. We'd be like, oh, bummer. But then we'd be like, wait a second. We know there's a lot more here. If we're at a restaurant, there's a 45 minutes of the check. And then we're going to migrate out to the lobby, and there's going to be another half an hour of chatting there. And then we're going to migrate out to the car, and there's going to be 45 minutes talking there. So even though they said they're leaving. But anyway, when I was really young, I didn't pay attention. But when I got a little older as a teen or in my 20s, I started getting really annoyed because I would see the pain on the wait staff's face of, what do we do here? Like they keep arguing about it. Okay, because you know someone's like, no, I'm gonna pay, and then someone's like, no, I'm gonna pay, and you know the wait staff's just like, well, please just someone pay. So absolutely, I would see that, and I would try to straddle that line. So actually, just a few days ago, I was with my big family, all my siblings. If you're on Instagram, you might have seen a picture of me and my siblings. Because my sister is in from out of town. My parents and my brothers live in town, but my sister was out of town. So we all got together and we did lots of activities and restaurants and stuff. And so as soon as I walked in the restaurant, I just gave my credit card to the waiter and said, don't let anyone else pay. And so it was all worked out. There was no arguing. You know, my sister tried to argue with me for a bit, and I was like, no, you're the guest of honor. And there was, you know, and that actually we did that even over texting. She was at the other side of the table, like this long table, and she was texting me like, hey, you know, how are we going to pay for this? And so that mom and dad don't have to pay. And I said, don't worry about it. It's already taken care of. And so I won as a Japanese American in my family because I managed to, you know, pay. And I straddled the line by not annoying the waiter. All right. That's the perfect scenario in my book. Honestly, like, because of my culture or my family culture or something, that was half of the enjoyment of that dinner, was how I pulled that off. Because under other circumstances, yeah, it would have been a whole rigmarole thing, and someone would have slipped me $100 bill in my coat. Actually, I should check. Well, it was hot out, so I probably didn't have a coat jacket that they could slip me money. Anyway. Blonde Sense says, Tammy has been supporting Asuelu's mom and also Asuelu financially for years, and I think she's done. She's trying to pass Asuelu the torch. That's interesting, Blood Sense. I didn't know that. So do you know that for sure? I could see that being the case. So Tammy has been supporting the parents for a long time, and Tammy is like, Asuelu, it's now your turn. You know, you need to be doing that. Now, she could say that. She could say, hey, I've been doing this for a long time. Could you please do it? That'd be a thing she could say. Adrian says, I feel like Asuelu's family uses money as a substitute for love, especially when you come from a background where you have no money. In my own family, my late grandparent was obsessed with money and used guilt manipulation to try to get money from others. My late grandparent came from a horribly abusive background filled with poverty, which most people today cannot even imagine. Right. It's, you know, very likely that I found this to be true when I would treat families, that this obsession with money at first confused me, and as time went on, I almost always found it to be related to a proxy for love, essentially. You could think of it, there's a number of different avenues, but one avenue is that as a child, you feel like you're being ripped off emotionally. You feel like no one's paying attention to you, or you're being mistreated. And you might even see your siblings or maybe other kids being treated differently, and you're just like, I'm being ripped off here by life, by my family and by life. And there's this notion of emotional currency that you're just not getting, and you're owed things. You deserve things. And because it might be too painful to think about the actuality of that, you can think about money instead as a proxy for that, and it just becomes your total obsession, and you talk about it all the time. But really what you've been talking about is the fact that you feel ripped off by life and by your family. Nat says, I see the MGMT album in the background. They're one of my favorite artists. Yeah, where is it? That is right there. Berto actually gave me this album during the 13th anniversary show, in which we did 13 straight hours of live streaming on YouTube, and I know some of you joined me, and that was fun. But yeah, it's one of our favorite albums together. 2007, 2008ish. We listened to this album all the time, and it still holds up, I think. Anyway, Devin and Jihoon. Demi says, I feel like there's nothing wrong with Jihoon's mother wishing he married a Korean woman. There's plenty of reasons why she would feel that way. Devin can't speak Korean, so their communication is extremely limited, and she's probably worried they'll eventually move to the States and she won't be able to see her grandkids. Right. So it's a complicated topic. Whenever we hear, if you had a white father from the American South saying, you can't marry that black man, what does that mean? Probably nothing good. You have a Korean mother in Korea talking to her Korean son. I really wish you would have married a Korean woman, but I'll accept Devin into my family. But yeah, I wish you would have married a Korean woman. Where does that come from? Is it a racism thing? Is it a xenophobic thing? Are these the factors that we could kind of relate to? That it's like, well, Jihoon's mom is like, I'm never going to have a relationship with my daughter-in-law because we can't speak to each other. And she's from a completely different culture. We don't understand each other. She's not into the things I'm into. I'm not into the things she's into. And one day she might skip town and go back to the States, and I'll never see my grandkids again. The other thing I'll say is that Koreans aren't necessarily not racist against white people. So I don't know this family, obviously, but it could also be a factor. I just can't know. Kosavare says, my mom argues that marrying within our culture saves a lot of headache. She also wants to preserve our culture and does not believe that can be done when marrying a foreigner. The problem is she will force her opinion upon me and expect me to follow what she says. I'm not dating a fellow Albanian at the moment, and she is not happy about it and tries to find the smallest things to argue about and convince me that he's not right for me, even when I tell her I'm currently in the healthiest relationship I've ever been in. Right. So I think that's the key differentiation, is if you have a preference, you're like, I always wanted you to marry an Albanian boy because I just, I want to carry on the culture, and I get along with Albanian people. I always wanted you to marry a Korean girl. And if you have that attitude, and it's not based on racism or xenophobia or some prejudice, then okay, I guess. But how do you communicate that to your kids? Do you pressure and pressure and pressure? Or do you just kind of keep it to yourself, honestly, or maybe just kind of mention it and say, but I love who you're dating right now, and I'm really happy you're in the healthiest relationship you've ever been in, because that's your happiness is more important than my philosophical hopes of carrying on, some sort of cultural line or something. Mike and Natalie videos. Angela, good old Angel Kate says, the way that Mike's mom is speaking to him feels like she is reinforcing a previously established idea that he is not lovable. That's interesting. I think someone else said so. Claudia says, what Mike's mom said is so insensitive. Telling someone that their spouse never loved them and they were just naive enough to get scammed is so incredibly painful to hear. That would make me feel like my own mother believes I'm gullible and unlovable. It's an interesting idea, and I hadn't thought about that. So it's, it seems like a perfectly viable line of investigation for this family if we were to work with them. That the mom, right, if you think about what the mom is saying, because on one hand, it's like, well, the mom's being really protective. She loves her son. But on the other hand, there's this other message of, potentially, I think, Mike, you are stupid. I think that no one really could love you because I don't think you're a lovable person. And this notion that she would love you is just absurd to me. So at the very least, that would make Mike feel stupid and maybe unlovable. And you just have to wonder, given the way that Trish acts, because we all understand that Mike has bothered his mom occasionally, right? Particularly as they were growing up, he was growing up. So if this is the way she approaches things in very black and white, very accusatory, very kind of paranoid places, then we wonder what Mike went through. Sarah says, my mom talks just like Mike's mom. She always expects you to take her side. She did that regarding my biological father. It makes me wonder about Mike and his dad. Absolutely. I'm always wondering about these other people in the family. Wasted says, I can't believe you didn't even crack a smile at the hat thing. Right. So there was the moment when the friend of Natalie comes into the house. You know, Natalie left and the friend comes in and is trying to be nice and hugs Mike, and the Mike's hat gets kind of akimbo. And so it says, I can't believe you didn't even crack a smile at the hat thing. It's the most The Office style scene I've ever seen in real life. Also, thank you for pointing out the compassion in that action. I hadn't really considered that because it was so awkward, but it must have taken guts and a big heart to comfort him at that time. Yeah, I mean, I see the comedy of it for sure. It was an awkward scene, but mostly I was just overwhelmed by her compassion. We don't see that very often on the show. And, she was being genuinely nice, and Mike was just being his normal, avoidant self that he's just like, yeah, okay, fine, go away, And I don't know. I wanted Mike to be comforted, and she was doing something. And because just think about all the other people in that position on the show that, she would come in and be like, you deserve, anyway. Demola says, what stuck out to me was when Natalie was talking about how she was depressed. So during the tell-all, what stuck out to me was when Natalie was talking about how she was depressed and suicidal and on medication, and that she didn't want to go on the medication anymore. And Mike was like, well, then don't take them. That was so uncaring. Right. It's hard to know where Mike is coming from. I don't know, but I suspect that Mike is one of those anti-psychotropics sort of people, anti-therapy kind of individuals. We've seen those kind of attitudes before, I think, from Mike. And it's possible that Mike actually even knows that she shouldn't be on the meds. It's just hard to say. But yeah, at the very least, you would hope that Mike would say, I'm really sorry that you were depressed, and are you doing okay right now? 21 Brat Girl says, I feel like the comments here are treating attachment styles like a lot of people treat astrology. They have one or maybe a few bad experiences with someone with that attachment style, and now everyone of that style is a terrible person. Interesting. Are people doing that? So on one hand, I can see the merit in that when you experience when you think about all your past partners and you sort of take a guess as to what attachment style someone would assess them with, you start to see patterns, and then you think, oh, maybe I should think about that before I engage in another relationship. It's actually a good thing to do. So on one hand, there's that. Now, if people are saying, oh, I'm never dating another avoidant person again, I mean, I don't know. I guess you can say that, but you don't want to be prejudicial about it, because there's if you say like, oh, preoccupied, they're so crazy and psycho, we don't want to say stuff like that. It's not true. It's mean spirited. So are people doing that? Yeah, it's not a good idea. And the thing that I'll say is I've never met anyone. So in the attachment theory literature, you have secure, which is supposed to be like 60%. Then you have avoidant, which should be about 15-20%, and you have preoccupied, 15-20%. You have disorganized, fearful, which is like 5%, something like that. There's various different studies, and when you go around the world, there are different proportions, but there's always a similar proportion of insecurity. There seems to be about 40% people will be categorized as one of the insecure attachment styles. So according to that, those figures, you think, well, most people are secure, most people are fine. No, I've never met a fine person attachment-wise. ever. I've never met anyone where I was like, oh my God, you are super healthy and secure and totally like you have no relational traumas and you're differentiated all the time. And that's not what the research is saying. You know, to be securely attached means that you tend to deal with things on average fairly okay. So to say like, well, I'm never going to date someone like that, it's like, well, you're probably like that. Everyone's like that. Everyone has issues. Tiffany and Ronald, Isabella says, yes, in South Africa, it is an ethical. So I was talking about, wait, is this an ethical problem in South Africa? Because Tiffany and Ronald were going to Ronald's uncle for couples therapy, because in my neck of the woods, no one would ever do that. And if they did, they'd possibly get in trouble for it because of the dual relationship issue. So it says, yes, in South Africa, it is an ethical issue. But if the person is a pastor, then it's okay. However, I wouldn't recommend it. All right. Maitri says, Colt and Vanessa. Vanessa had the man up. Oh, right. So I was like, well, where were they with? Because the therapist for Tiffany and Ronald was saying, you have to, Tiffany, you have to please your husband. Something like that. I was like, what is happening here? Is this similar to that man up therapist? And I was thinking, who was the couple that was in the man up therapist? And it was Colt and Vanessa. They had a therapist. Behind the therapist's head was a poster that said "Man Up." I think that's all it said or something. And it's one thing if that's in your house, but if you have it behind your head, things that, as every therapist understands this, that when clients are looking at you, they're occasionally looking at everything behind you. And if you're putting something like that behind you, you're really, putting your stake in the ground and saying like, this is who I am. This is my belief system. And I don't know where he's coming from with that poster, but I'm just going to take a guess and say I wouldn't be enthusiastic about where he's coming from. This little jelly bean says it should be on the 90-day cast contracts that they have to watch all of Dr. Honda's reaction videos, and then he should come to the tell-all. Interesting. It shouldn't be in the contract. That's nice of you to say, jelly bean, but the other thing I'll say is that, occasionally people will say, oh, you should go on the show. You should go on the tell-all, or you should interact with them. And what I'll say to that is, at first it seems attractive to me. Like, oh, that'd be kind of fun. It'd be an interesting little twist to my career, I suppose. Maybe spread the word about attachment and other kinds of things to the masses. But I've had enough. I've dipped my toe enough into that kind of stuff to realize that it's never as fun or as satisfying as I hope it will be. And I resolved a long time ago, and people have reached out to me kind of in not TLC, but other kinds of things. And I have made the choice, just so y'all know, that I'm 99.9% sure I'm never going to do anything like that. For a number of reasons. One, I like my autonomy. I don't like working for other people. I like other people. I like working with other people. I don't like working under other people, because you're just rolling the dice as to how competent your boss is going to be. And so there's that kind of, and when you're working, if TLC asked me to come on their show, I'd be dealing with that whole rigmarole, all the producers and and what I found is those people, they're not exactly interested in the truth. They're not exactly interested in like long form clinical answers like the kinds that I want to give. They're interested in sound bites and real quick things, and they're looking for sensational statements. If you ever see those, like I was interviewed on a Tiger King documentary on the Discovery Channel actually last summer. And this was actually one of the last nails in the coffin for me in terms of doing these kinds of things, because it's like, oh, Tiger King is real hot right now, and they want me to be on the documentary, and I went through all the steps, and logistically it's a nightmare, because like right now I'm just in my office, I'm by myself, I'm at home, the pod wife is upstairs watching TV, my dogs are everything's relaxed. I can stop at any time, I can edit whenever. When you're dealing with like actual TV producers, like you're at their, you have no control over anything. You have no control over how they shoot you, what questions they answer, how they edit you. That's a big thing. And so I don't know why I'm telling you this right now, but I just thought I'd tell y'all, like, I don't think I'm ever gonna go on those kinds of shows. I don't even think I want to talk, so here's another sort of angle of this. In the beginning, like Love is Blind people and 90 Day Fiancé people would reach out to me over Instagram or something and be like, oh, let's interact. Ash reached out to me, if you remember that thing. And I enjoyed those interactions, but I found that it was just never as satisfying as I thought it would be, as I hoped it would be. And it also kind of convoluted what I'm trying to do. How do I put this? I will say that if a cast member came to me, like say Big Ed, for example, came to me and said, you've said, Big Ed says, Kirk, you've said some things about my personality that I think might be true. I don't know, but I want to ask you some questions about my behavior and about how you see my behavior. Can we have a conversation offline or even online? I might consider doing that. I don't know if I would, but I'm pretty careful about things because I have a clinical license I have to protect. But I might consider doing something like that because my hope is that when people watch it, they could learn from it, right? But a lot of the interactions that I'll have, it's just a lot of, I don't know, it's just kind of like chatting or something, and so it doesn't have that kind of educational angle to it, which I'm always looking for. The other thing is that I think it challenges. So another aspect, I don't know why I'm going into this right now, but I guess it's been a while since I've made one of these comment videos. How long has this been going on for? A long time. Is that when I'm sitting in my office right now and there's no one around, I feel free to say whatever I want. And when I start interacting with cast members, I start worrying that I'm going to hurt their feelings. And I'm always kind of worried I'm going to hurt their feelings, because I never want to hurt their feelings. And I'm mortified when I find out that someone's watching, from the cast, and I'm like, did I say anything that would hurt their feelings? I really don't want that, but it does hinder me a little bit. And so I want to limit, if not eliminate, any contact I have with really anyone on these shows, producers, cast members, anyone, because as a as a podcaster for the past 13 years, when you get up in your head, everything gets thrown off and you can't really do your thing anymore. And so this little cocoon I have in my office right now, I kind of like it, and I don't want it to change. I don't plan on it ever changing. Because another reason why I say this is sometimes people reach out and say, maybe you should have your own TLC show, or you should have your own show like Dr. Oz does or Dr. Phil does or something. And I've had enough of a glimpse of that kind of life to know that you would have to, there's not a paycheck that you could pay me that would make that an enjoyable thing. I have so many years left, a certain amount of years left on this planet. I don't want to waste it doing something that I don't like to do, and I like to do this. Tiffany and Ronald, the moment where Ronald said, know your place. LIA says, for a long time now, Ronald's been giving me the family annihilator vibes. He seems like the type of man whose rage will make him do that. Also, him saying he won't let Tiffany leave with the kids is so scary. Doesn't mean I think he will do it, but I see that potential in him. Yeah, so definitely Ronald has some red flags, if not full-on behaviors of a intimate partner violence perpetrator. Absolutely. Saying something like, know your place, and I'm not going to let you take my kids away from me. That's just not going to happen. Other kinds of behaviors that he's exhibited are in the category, under the umbrella of intimate partner violence, and thus to be scared or triggered or to be concerned is to be rational. Now, to think that he's a family annihilator, meaning that he's someone like, Chris Watts, who will annihilate their entire family in a tragic manner. I don't know if we have any evidence. That's a very rare individual that will do that. And I find that this accusation gets thrown around a lot. I'll tell you, it was thrown around at me. I don't know why I did this, but I went to Reddit a few months ago. Maybe someone sent me something like, oh, they're talking about you on Reddit. And so I know better, but I started flipping through it. And, the first number of comments are fine. I'm like, oh, okay, it's nice to get some interaction with the listeners. But then I start scrolling down, and at the bottom are these downvoted things. And someone said that I gave serial killer vibes. And I'm like, what? Me? I give serial killer? How is that possible? Like, and then I thought, well, I've kind of heard that thrown around a lot, particularly to men, where there's a dude on the internet. It's like, oh, he kind of seems like a serial killer. And as a bystander, I would go, I don't see that, but I get, see what you want to see, I guess. But as a target, as a victim of that, because I do think that is a slight victimization to just call someone a killer, like, yikes, right? I'm talking about prejudice, right? And liable. It's just, anyway. So as someone who's experienced that, I really try to be careful about perpetrating and propagating and perpetuating those kinds of statements. So absolutely LIA, abusive behavior, family annihilator. No, there's no indication of that. Could he? What is the profile of a family annihilator? It's hard to know. I mean, obviously, psychopathic tendencies is a well, but even of psychopaths, the vast majority don't harm anyone in that way ever. So, and the thing is, it's such a rare thing that we have a hard time developing a common profile across these different individuals. There are certain things that you can point to, but any of those elements or components that we can observe in individuals after the fact that they seem to have a common, the vast majority who have those set of markers never harm anyone in that way at all. So anyway, I just want to say that. Linda says, watching this, I'm so concerned for her emotional and physical well-being. For Tiffany, his need to dominate is chilling. Yeah. Paola says, I wonder if Stacy is ever annoyed and says, don't you Dr. Honda me, Kirk. What? I wonder if the podwife, Stacy, is ever annoyed with me and says, don't you Dr. Honda me. No, she's never said that. We have a relationship beyond this podcast. She wouldn't refer to me as Dr. Honda. She might say, well, she's never, she's never said to me, don't analyze me, don't act like a therapist with me. One, because I think she's more mature than that. I also really try to avoid that, honestly. I mean, I can never get rid of the therapist in me. And when I am in fights with people, I'm often thinking of the principles that I try to teach and try to engender in my clients, differentiation or attachment awareness, self-awareness. And so I definitely talk like a therapist, or I talk like me when I'm in a conflict with someone. But I'm a human being. I'm not always a professor, believe me. And so I would, a long time ago, actually the worst transgression of this that I did to people was before I became a therapist. I had decided I was 24 years old, and I just suddenly said, I'm going to be a therapist. And I started to apply to graduate schools. And so there was there's about 7 months there where I knew I wanted to be a therapist, but I wasn't in graduate school yet. And during those 7 months, I thought of myself as a therapist. I started sort of, putting on the mantle of a therapist and thinking of myself as a therapist. But of course, I didn't know what a therapist was, because I was just a 24-year-old jock, kid who knew nothing about the world. And I thought that a therapist was someone who caught people on things and would analyze people and, oh, I see you. And I would do that occasionally during that time. Once I a week into graduate school, it was immediately apparent that that's not what therapists did. And then I, disabused myself of that silly notion. But during those 7 months, I did that. And one of those moments is on camera. I've always had a video camera around documenting my life. I'm that kind of person. And so this is 1995, and I have this, I have one of those giant video cameras with the VCR on. It's like my dad's hand-me-down video camera. And I'm at this party. Had a house party at my house near Green Lake that I was renting with all my other friends. And we're sitting around, we're talking, and I'm talking to all my old friends. And in this video, I'm like, oh, it's one of the most cringe inducing things I've ever seen in my life. When I watch it, I'm just, oh, Kirk, what are you doing? Anyway, so I think from that point forward, I have always tried to avoid coming across that way. And I think when people are feeling put upon by a therapist, it's when, as the therapist, you're dominating. You're being the know-it-all. You're saying, I know what's happening. I've analyzed you. I'm right. You're using your knowledge and your industry ability, your occupational ability to dominate and to put someone else down and to make someone else feel like like they're incompetent. And of course, that's not okay and wouldn't meet my needs. So that's why I don't do it. But I suppose we'd have to ask the podwife about this. But she's a pretty nice person, so even if I did do that occasionally, she'd probably say that I didn't. Zesty says, I didn't know physically intimidating people, but without striking them was an abusive thing to do. Right, so I was talking about how in Washington State and in other jurisdictions, it's considered assaultive to intimidate people and to threaten them or to physically dominate. Like the common example is you pick up a chair, like you're arguing with your spouse and you pick up a chair and you throw it against the wall. You don't even throw it towards your partner. You throw it like a different direction. That is grounds for a legal action in my jurisdiction. And so that's what the Zesty is saying. I didn't know that physically intimidating people, but without striking them, was an abusive thing to do. My parents used this on me a lot, and it's had lasting effects on my mental health. I was always confused as to why I had some trauma responses when I previously believed I had a normal, functional childhood. Yeah. The idea goes is that, and it's not always, doesn't always have this effect, but when you pick up a chair and you throw it against the wall, or you get big, or you stand over someone, or you yell, or you flash someone, the idea is, I am escalating right now, and you don't want to see the next step here. I've taken it to this level. You don't want to know if you make me angrier, because you just, believe me, you don't want to know what I'm going to do to you next. It definitely has that communication, that message, and that's frightening. That is absolutely frightening. And you can people can do this in ways that are very subtle. Without even raising your voice, without throwing a chair against the wall. There are people who know how to get under your skin and how to terrify you in ways. And it's, oof. Elizabeth and Andre, good old Abominable Snowman. I love that name. I could see Luke being angry if Han got a job with Darth for the same reasons as Charlie. Right, so I was talking about, I can't remember the analogy, but I was using a Star Wars analogy, and so Abominable Snowman is saying, I could see Luke being angry if Han got a job from Darth. But, the analogy breaks down right there because Luke and Han were obviously against Darth Vader. So, anyway. Kerfuffle Bus, which is another great name. Hi, Dr. Honda. Could you do a video talking about emotional attunement and what it looks like? Well, I've done many episodes on emotional attunement, including my deep dive, which is available to patrons, on attachment theory. But to be brief about emotional attunement, it is to attachment attunement is to notice someone's emotional state, to notice what they're going through, their subjective experience, and to respond appropriately. So with your children, and because that's usually what people are interested in, your child is sad about something, but not crying. But your kid is sullen and maybe a little slower, maybe occasional sigh. And if you're attuned, then one, you have one eye on that child at least occasionally, enough to go, oh, I'm noticing sighing, I'm noticing subdued, they seem a little bit more sullen than usual. Okay, what do I do with that? How do I respond? And it's complicated, right? Because it's multi-staged. You know, what's the first thing you say? How do you react when they say I'm fine? And, you know, do you approach them later? That's attunement. It's noticing and responding appropriately, responding in a differentiated, effective way. Basically, a way that soothes the other person, a way that helps, the way that helps the other person. So if the other person is sad and depressed, and you notice, first of all, you notice the behavioral markers of that, and then you respond in a way that lifts their spirits a little bit. Now, maybe it doesn't completely erase the depression or whatever, but the person feels heard and understood and seen. That's a big part of attunement, is I see you. And people ask me sometimes, like, I want to be a good parent. What do I do? Parenting is infinitely complicated, but one of the attachment things you can do, attunement things you can do, a principle that you can follow is, when possible and you have time and energy and you see your kid doing something, is to just comment, just say what you see in them. I see that you have a lot of joy. I see that you do not want to go to bed. I see that you don't want to eat your breakfast this morning. I hear you that you do not like your little sister. I notice that you're very grumpy right now. I see that you want a cookie and that you really like cookies. I'm noticing that you love Jell-O. Like, it sounds obnoxious, but a little bit of that can go a long way, because kids, they don't know what they're going through. You know, kids, they have no way of conceptualizing their subjective experience. And to help kids to become more emotionally aware, you will just say what you see, and they're like, oh, is that, you know, because they're just, you know, when they're eating their Jell-O, they're just like, I'm eating, you know, they're not reflecting on themselves. They're just blissing out, right? And for someone to say, wow, I see you love Jell-O. I love Jell-O too. It makes me feel so good. And when I do that, I'm reminded of my mom. My mom is really good at this. She had a daycare, and I would watch her attune to like 13 kids under the age of 5. And I was just like, whoa. I didn't know it was attunement back then. But my mom, she's very verbal in this way. And she just knows how to connect with kids of all ages, even adults. Kids anyway. So the kid is like, oh, is that what's happening right now? I'm enjoying this Jell-O. Oh, the mind's eye looks at the self and says, oh, and is contained, is held. You know, there's an emotional holding, because kids are terrified of the world and they don't want to be alone. And a way that humans feel together is to know each other, is to say, I know you, I see you, I know what you're going through, I feel what you're going through. You know, you're enjoying your Jell-O. I like Jell-O too. It makes me feel so good. And the kid's like, oh, I'm seen, I'm heard, they get me. I'm not alone. Okay, so that's emotional attunement. Tidemanus. Dr. Kirk says, the pillars. So this is when Andre and Charlie were fighting. And I said, the pillars of masculinity are at it again. Normally, I would be thinking violence is not the answer, but yeah, just have at it. Tidemanus. This is actually not the reaction I was expecting from Dr. Honda. I was expecting Dr. Kirk to condemn the violence, but at this point, even Dr. Kirk is throwing up his hands. Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not going to, well, I don't know. I mean, I come from a world where there was a fair amount of violence, not in my family, but with my peers. I played a lot of contact sports, and there were fights in college, and I don't think it's a good idea, but I'm not going to say that you don't. I mean, if you really want to, you know, if Charlie and Andre really wanted to fight, then, you know, it's like, you know, I think they can, I think they both know what they're getting into, and I think they could both handle themselves. I kind of think Andre would throttle Charlie, to be honest. Who knows? Because Andre just seems like a ball of, I don't know what, anger and just rage. So yeah, I'm not condoning or discondoning the behavior, but at some point you just think maybe it'll help. I don't know. That's ridiculous. No, I should have a hard line. No violence. Lean says nobody comforted the dad while he was weeping. That made me feel bad. Yeah, me too. Tiffany says the other siblings have said some things that made me think Charlie has some sort of substance abuse issue. The girls told their dad that you need to get him help and tried to talk him into getting the mom involved. Yeah, I saw a number of comments along these lines, these accusations that Charlie and Megan, his wife, are on cocaine or something. And okay, unless you have some sort of special data that can point in that direction, and you know, there's some circumstantial evidence here. We just don't really know. They all could be on drugs. They all were drinking. We know that, or a lot of them were drinking. So I know enough about cocaine or meth or speed use to know that it's hard to tell. I mean, unless someone's really quintessentially tweaking, then it's just hard to tell. Maybe Charlie does. Maybe he doesn't. I will say that Charlie's behavior has been extremely consistent, I mean, over the years. So his behavior with Andre, that one, you know, when they almost got into a fight, where they did, I wasn't surprised. Charlie walked in and said something like, "I'm here, call the cops," which also could be another minor circumstantial evidence that he's communicating to his family around, like, yep, I'm doing illegal things with drugs. Anyway, but he walked in and he kind of went towards Andre, but then Andre said, "Sit down," you know, like, knock it off and sit down. Well, that's obviously going to provoke Charlie. We know Charlie can't stand by and just let that go. And so he came over and said, "You're not going to tell me what to do." And then, you know, anyway. Akiko says, "All I can think about is how damaging this environment is for the children." Yeah, I think about that all the time. Anon says, "The way Charlie and his wife are acting in this scene, I think they may have snorted something before they arrived at the party. It would explain why nobody is taking Charlie's side this time." Yeah, you know, like I said, I don't know, maybe. Darcy and Stacy. Lemon says, "Very interesting about Darcy's lack of curiosity." Right, so I was talking about how Tom was saying that Darcy was not curious about even who he was, and there seems to be some evidence that that's how she approaches things. I noticed that something was off about the way she relates to her men, but couldn't pinpoint it. With all these relationships, with all three relationships, Jesse, Tom, and Georgie, the cameras haven't shown any getting to know you conversations that weren't about Darcy's desperate need for validation. No wonder she struggles in relationships. Hoop says, "Even if Georgie was stashing cash in case he wants to make a quick getaway, does he not have that right? People should be allowed to leave a relationship." Yeah, absolutely. But we also know that would trigger Darcy. Andy says, "Stacy's ex-husband wouldn't give consent for her boys to be on the show, which I think is for the best." Right, so I was talking about how I'm concerned about children being on any show because of the idea of consent, right? When you kids, and you know, whenever you see a kid in a reality TV show and their face isn't blurred out, the kid likely signs something saying they consent to be on the show, and the parents would sign something too. And my whole contention, which is obvious, is that I don't think anyone thinks that a child, particularly, I mean, maybe you could say a 16-year-old could knowingly sign that paper, but I think all of us understand like a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old doesn't have the ability to knowingly consent to that kind of thing. And parents should really avoid that because it's not necessary. Darcy's daughters, although they seem to be, you know, taking everything in stride, we don't need to have them on the show, right? You know, we need Darcy and Stacy and Florian and Georgie. We don't need Darcy's kids. We've never needed Darcy's kids to be on the show. And apparently, for Andy is saying that Stacy's ex-husband wouldn't give consent for her boys to be on the show. Interesting. Yeah. So we just have to, I don't know what we can do about it. I don't know if we have to write letters to TLC and say like, hey, could you just scale back on the involving the kid, you know, like Daniel, Tiffany and Ronald kid. Maybe it'll be, so two things. One is that like I said, we all understand that kids can't knowingly provide consent. But the other thing is like there's this assumption that it's always a bad thing for kids, which it isn't. It isn't always a bad thing. Actually, I did a whole episode on this a year ago, maybe a couple years ago. I looked into how many of these individuals have come forward as adults and said that it was really harmful to them. And, you know, there are a number of famous cases, but there's a lot of kids who enter, showbiz when they're young. So if you have, I don't know, 100,000 kids, you're going to have some cases where things go wrong. So it's hard to know exactly what the prevalence rate of something horrible happening to kids. Obviously, we need restraints like making sure that they are still in school and that their work hours are a certain amount, which, you know, a lot of states will have. Anyway, point is that it's not a universally bad thing. So we don't want to look at it and just be like, oh my God, all those kids are being damaged. I just think we need to be careful. And like I said, it's not like a human need. It's not like a national emergency that we have kids on these shows. We don't need to have them on these shows. We could survive with it. We could survive without them and lower the risk, obviously. Cat's Pajamas says, I think Cat's Pajamas has commented before. I don't think I've ever seen Darcy really see another person, really look at someone to interact with who the other person really is. It's like she has a scenario in her head of how the relationship is supposed to go, and she enacts her part in the scenario. And when the other person doesn't play his part, she freaks out and blames the person for not knowing who he was. Yeah, that's a good observation. The Octavia episode, Drop Dead, says, I love this channel, and I got my boyfriend into this channel. He always says, hey, can we watch the Hey Deserving Listeners guy? So I'm the Hey Deserving Listeners guy? Yeah, that makes sense. Caroline says, does Dr. H think there is a bias in American culture against people like Georgie who behave in a reserved, private manner? My husband and I are both a little reserved. Folks seem to be really angry with emotional, reserved individuals. Right. So it's possible that Georgie's reserved nature is being misinterpreted because of an American cultural idea or just a Darcy thing. And absolutely, in my life, there have been modes of, you know, circumstances in my life where I absolutely was the reserved one. And I would be called that. I'd be like, oh, you're so reserved. And I always found that to be, not always, but occasionally it would be said in a hostile way, like, you know, you're reserved. Like, and I'm like, is it not okay for me to be a little bit reserved and private about my life, or not exactly talkative in work meetings? Is that okay with people? Like, am I somehow doing something wrong? And I think there is something to be said for that. And I learned the hard way that if you're really reserved, you come across like you hate everybody. So you need to have some small talk. And you know, early in my life, when I was in my early 20s, mid 20s, I was still holding on to this idea that I didn't have to. I remember saying, you know, because people would say like, oh, you know, you're so reserved and you make me uncomfortable. You're intimidating, they would say. And I would say, well, that's on you, because I'm just being quiet. I'm just being reserved, and you're like projecting something, and you're distorted. So the fact that you think that I'm intimidating you, that's a personal problem, because I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm just being quiet. I'm just not interested in small talk. And you know, it's a very childish thing to say, because of course the world is the way that it is, and you can't just go through life on this fantasy that you can live like that. So I learned the hard way that I had to start to actually engage in some small talk, which wasn't comfortable for me. I'm an anxious person. And so I pushed myself to do that. And, you know, people were more at ease with me, and they stopped being intimidated by me, or at least I think they did. And I had to, you know, live in the world. So on one hand, to be very reserved is potentially, you know, missing the point of life and of society. You know, like you know, you're somewhat responsible for making people feel a little bit comfortable. People are responsible for making each other feel comfortable within reason. Having said that, if you're doing that and you're just a little quiet, or you just don't really raise your hand in meetings or something, and somehow people have a prejudice about you, then that's not okay. And it does happen. All right, TikTok. So I post, people were asking me about the dissociative identity disorder on TikTok and the faking issue. Christy says, it's possible that there is a monetary and social incentive by pretending to have DID on TikTok. It's always been a quick way to gain followers because people are fascinated by this disorder. All right. And he says, I have heard the suggestion when parenting to reframe what we see as attention-seeking behavior to see it as connection-seeking behavior. Right. I'm glad you bring this up, Annie, and it's something I probably should remind myself about. That we wonder about people faking DID on TikTok and wonder if it's attention-seeking behavior. And a more accurate and more compassionate way of seeing attention-seeking behavior is connection-seeking behavior, which I absolutely do believe. Snycollect says, I don't have DID, but I do dissociate under certain stressors. I know I'm me and I know my reality, but the world doesn't feel real and my body feels strange and emotionless. It's incredibly scary and not fun. Yeah, dissociation is not fun most of the time for most people. Toto says, I'm diagnosed with DID, and when I started noticing the role-playing trend online, I decided I wouldn't disclose unless strictly necessary that I have it. These people are not destigmatizing DID. They are ridiculing it and mocking it and creating a misleading stereotype. Well, thanks for chiming in on that, Toto. Yeah, I haven't watched many of the videos. I've watched some, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm sorry that's happening to you, and it's completely unfair, and people shouldn't be doing that. All right. Well, that's just got to be the longest comments video I've ever made, in which I rambled about all sorts of random things. All right, well, tune in next time when I do another comments video next week. And take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.